If, let's say, the internment camp did not happen, and they could have sent my mother and my father to college, they could have became engineers or doctors or whatever, but they lost that. They lost that because their grandparents lost everything.
This is Arlene Watkins, a volunteer interviewer with the Kizuna Project. It's May 16th, 2026, and I'm in Tucson with Ray Akazawa. Ray, do I have permission to record you?
Yes.
So let's start off with some basic information. When and where were you born?
I was born in 1949 in Los Angeles, California.
And your grandparents on both sides of your family were affected by the World War II. Can you tell me a little about that?
Yeah, my grandparents on my father's side lived in Japan during World War II, and my grandparents on my mother's side lived in the United States during World War II. So they had completely different experiences during World War II. And let me start out with my grandparents on my father's side, who were living in Japan during World War II. And I will refer to them as grandfather Akazawa and grandmother Akazawa. So both of them were born in Okayama, Japan in the 1880s. And my grandfather, when he turned 17, his father, or my great-grandfather, told my grandfather, because he was the third son, and back in Japan during that time, unless you were the oldest son, you didn't inherit any of the property, all right? So his father, or my great-grandfather, told my grandfather, you need to go to the United States and earn some money, and after you earn enough, you could come back to Japan and buy some property. So that's what my grandfather did, and around 1904, around there, he went over to the United States, and he moved over to Seattle, and he was able to earn enough money. Oh, he went over there with his wife too, okay? And he went over to Seattle, and he was able to earn enough money that he was able to come back in around 1921. But while he was in America, and this is very important, he had 3 sons, and they were all born in the United States. And so they were U.S. citizens, all right? And because of the fact that they were U.S. citizens, that seriously affected them later on in life, which I'll tell you about soon, all right? So once my grandfather earned enough money, in around 1921, he came back to Japan, all right? And he was able to buy a house there. And while in 1925, he had a 4th son, and that son was born in Japan. And that's pretty important because he was born in Japan, and that meant he was a Japanese citizen, and he could potentially be drafted into the Japanese army. And that would seriously affect his life, all right? So while my dad was in Japan, and even though he was a U.S. citizen, he went to elementary school, and he was so smart that he just skipped middle school, and he went directly into high school, all right? But unfortunately, when he graduated from high school and he tried to apply for college, the colleges wouldn't accept him because he was a U.S. citizen, all right? So then my grandfather told my dad, you need to just go back to America, all right? Because at least if you go back to America, you'll be able to maybe go to college or get a nice education, right? So my dad in 1931, he went back to the United States, and of course he didn't speak any English, so that was another problem. but he was smart enough. He went to school during the day, and he worked at night. And after 4 years, he was able to speak and write fluent English. But on top of that, his teacher said, you're really good at math. Why don't you just become a math teacher? So he was doing that too. All right. And so he was in the United States from around 1931 to 1936. And then in 1936, his dad, who was living in Japan, told my dad, you need to come back and get your brother, all right? He's having the same problem. He's graduated from high school. He's a U.S. citizen. And so he can't get into college, all right? So come back to Japan, take him, and bring him back to the United States, all right? So that's what he did in 1936. He went back to Japan, got his brother, and then came back to the United States. And so from 1936 to 1941, my dad worked in the produce business. But then in March of 1941, he got drafted into the American Army, all right? And then he attended the Army Medical School in El Paso, and basically during the war, he drove around ambulances and cared for the wounded. My reasoning on why he didn't end up fighting is because he was educated in Japan, all right? So there might have been some concerns that, he could be a spy or something like that. So let's put him someplace, in the United States where he can't be spying, if he's in Europe or wherever, So that's what he did during the war. But even though he got drafted in March of 1941, 6 months later, on September 20th, he married my mother, all right? And then unfortunately, when you look at these dates, September 20th, 1941, that was a few months before Pearl Harbor, all right? Then Pearl Harbor occurred, and then President Roosevelt, a few months later, signed that infamous Executive Order 9066, all right? And then immediately after that, my mother and her family and my dad's brother, who was living in the United States, were all sent to the Gila River internment camp, even though they were U.S. citizens, all right? So now what my dad had to do to visit his wife, he would visit them in his U.S. Army uniform, and he would go into the internment camp and visit my mother, right? And then my grandfather, Akazawa, who was living in Japan, he passed away in 1943. And then the following year, his youngest son, who was born in Japan, which meant that he could be drafted into the Japanese Army, so he was drafted into the Japanese Army. And then a few years later, he died in Manchuria. All right. So if you can imagine my grandparents in Japan, they had one son, their oldest son, in the U.S. Army. They had another son that was interned in the Japanese, in Japanese internment camp in Gila River in the United States. And their youngest son was initially fighting for the Japanese Army. So my dad was in the U.S. Army, and his younger brother was in the Japanese Army. And then, unfortunately, like I said, my dad's youngest son ended up dying in 1946. And the other thing sad about this is the Japanese leadership knew way back in July of 1944 2 years before my dad's younger brother passed away, okay, died fighting, the Japanese military command already knew they couldn't win the war, because once they lost Saipan, that meant that the United States could actually go to the main islands and start bombing. Okay, they were close enough to use their B-29s to go to Japan and start bombing. And so after July of 1944, that's what the United States did. They started bombing all the factories in Japan. So Japan couldn't even build any new aircraft. They couldn't build any new ships. They can't replenish their munitions. But they kept on fighting, all right? And for another year. And so sometimes you wonder whether my dad's younger brother sort of, that was a wasted life because he was just fighting when the Japanese leadership already knew that they had lost the war. All right. So that's the story of my grandparents who lived in Japan.
So now tell me about your grandparents on your mother's side.
Yeah, so that's a whole different experience when you have Asians that lived on the West Coast during World War II. All right. So my I'll call him Grandfather Mizote, okay, because that's my mother's maiden name. And so he was also born in Okayama, all right. But his situation was a little bit different because he came over unmarried. My grandfather on my father's side, he came over with a wife, all right? But my grandfather on my mother's side, he came over single initially. And he settled, again, in Seattle, Washington. I guess that's where a lot of these people decided to go initially. And his father told him the same thing because my grandfather on my mother's side was again the third son. So, you know, my great-grandfather or my grandfather's father told him the same thing. You need to go to America, all right, because I'm not going to give you anything when I pass away, all right. So he came to America, and from 1904 to 1915, he worked on the railroad and farming, and finally he had enough money to return to Japan to find a wife. And that's what he did in 1915. He went back to Japan, found a wife, and we married my grandmother, Mizote. Well, once my grandparents came back from Japan in 1915, from like 1918 to 1920, they had my mother and 4 other siblings, all right? And they were all U.S. citizens, all right? They were all U.S. citizens, all right? And I keep on repeating this, U.S. citizens, and later on you understand why I keep on repeating that, all right? And then in 1920, they had the Alien Land Act. And what that did was prohibited people that were born in Japan from owning property in the United States, all right? And that was mainly implemented because the farmers who were non-Asian were worried that the Japanese farmers were just going to take over all the land and take over all their business, all right? So they needed some way to stop that. So, okay, we'll just not allow them to own land, all right? But my grandfather was able to kind of sidestep that a little bit by leasing land from a Nisei, who is a U.S. citizen. All right, so that's what he did. He ended up leasing this Nisei would actually buy the land, and then he would lease it to my grandfather. All right, and so he was able to get about 25 acres. And he was able to grow strawberries and tomatoes and various other fruits and vegetables, and was quite successful. And in fact, he was so successful that he was able to buy a car, buy tractors, build a house, and have a rather elaborate wedding when my mother got married in 1941, right? In September of 1941, right? But then we had the December 7th, 1941 event, and everything changed. Yeah, everything changed. A week after that happened, my grandfather, while he was out, on the fields, they grabbed him and took him to prison. And then from there, they took him over to Santa Fe, New Mexico, and interrogated him for 6 months. And finally, he was able to rejoin his family, who by that time had already been evacuated from the Los Angeles area over to Gila River internment camp in Arizona. I actually ended up visiting that camp, and it's a desolate place. I couldn't imagine how people could live there. And so they were in this internment camp, and drinking water was sometimes stopped, all right? They would have to worry about snakes and scorpions and Gila monsters coming into their cabin. And that area of Arizona, it could get up to like 125 degrees in the summer, and as cold as, in the low 30s in the winter. So during the summer, it was just too hot to stay in those barracks. They would just sleep outside, all right? And they lost a lot of their privacies because the shower and toilet facilities, they didn't have any partitions, all right? So they would have to take a shower, and in fact, some of them, the way they kind of avoided to get more privacy, they'll go out in the middle of the night and use it, all right, when hopefully no one's there. But then they'll go there and find out there's a lot of other people trying to do the same thing. All right. So that's where they were. And the other thing is there's this Munson report that came out right before the Executive Order 9066. And the Munson report, the summary on the Munson report was that the Japanese people on the West Coast are not a threat, all right? In fact, they were actually able to break into the Japanese consulate, into the safe of the Japanese consulate, and they were able to get some information out of there. And even that, the Japanese consulate said, these Japanese people that live on the West Coast, we can't convert them, all right? They're too dedicated to the United States, all right? But independent of that, they still executed this order, and 110 to 120,000 people of Japanese descent were put into these 10 internment camps spread out in all these desolate places in the United States. So what happened with my grandfather, here he is, 1941, very successful, had a lot of money. By the time he got out in 1945, he had lost everything, all right? So he had worked from like 1940 to 1941, like 37 years, and he had nothing to show for it. Zero, nothing to show for it. And so while he was in camp, he started drinking heavily, started smoking heavily, and he was very embittered about this whole situation. And so after he got out of camp, a few years later, he just he died of a heart attack. And so, and the other interesting thing that happened in the internment camp is my older sister was born in the internment camp. It turns out that there was if you look at all the internment camps, there was probably about 6,000 or 7,000 babies that were born in the internment camps. All right. So that's my grandfather Mizota's sad story. The bottom line is it really affected the Issei generation, which my grandfather was. A lot of them, if you end up talking to the kids that were able to talk to their grandparents, the Issei, a lot of them would come back and say, yeah, they were just broken, by the internment camp. And some of them, I imagine, wanted to commit suicide, whatever, right? Because they worked all their lives and they lost everything. And by the time they came out, they didn't have really enough time to gain the wealth that they had before they went.
So that was obviously that affected your parents and your family when they got out of the camps. Tell me about the effect of Executive Order 9066 on your immediate family.
Yeah, that's an interesting question because I consider that it's sort of a lost generation thing where, my grandparents came over here, they started with nothing, and right before the war, they had accumulated enough wealth where they could send their kids to college, right? But my parents, because of the internment camp, had to start all over again. They had nothing because their parents or my grandparents didn't have anything they could give them, all right? So they had to start all over again. So my parents, we first initially moved in right after the war into this 1-bedroom, 1-bath house. And it was myself, my mother, and my 2 sisters and myself. We're all sleeping in this 1-bedroom, sharing this one bathroom because that's all that my parents could afford. And my dad, he would work like 19-hour days. If you're in the produce business, sort of your daily routine is you get up at 2 in the morning, and you go to the farmer's market, get all your produce from 3 o'clock to 6 o'clock, and then you go to your produce market, and from like 6 to 8 or 6 to 9, you have to take all this produce out of your truck and put it onto the displays, and then from 9 to 6. You're running the cash register to sell all this produce. And then at 6, after you close up, all the produce you didn't sell, you need to take all that back and put it back into the refrigerator. Otherwise, if you leave it overnight, it's going to perish. So then you finally get home at 9, and he had left at 2 in the morning. So that's like a 19-hour day. And he would do this for like 13 days in a row. And then finally, he would just take one Sunday off. And then after that, he'd do it for another 13 days in a row, 19-hour days. And then my mother, she would, they would drop us off at our grandmother's house. And my mother would be working 8 or 9 hours a day, working as a seamstress and later as an assembler at a cosmetic factory. All right. So they did this for 40 years, all right, just trying to make ends meet. But then my dad told me, all right, unless you want to work as hard as I am, you need to get good grades in school and go to college, right? Otherwise, you're going to be working 19-hour a day. And I said, okay, I do not want to do that. I'm going to college. So that's what I did. I was My two sisters and myself, we all went to college and got good degrees, and we were able to retire young, and now we're just goofing off and traveling all over the place. But so when I think about this, if, let's say, the internment camp did not happen, all right, that would mean my grandparents were pretty well off, and they could have sent my mother and my father to college, all right. They could have became engineers or doctors or whatever, and they could have just had to work, only, like normal people, 5 days a week, 8 hours a day, all right. But they lost that. They lost that because their grandparents lost everything. So that's one of the things in terms of how it affected my parents' life and my life, is that my parents had to sacrifice, again, like my grandparents did, and working hard and everything so that their kids could get a nice education and not have to work that hard, all right? So.
And what did your career entail after? Where did you go to college, and what did your career entail?
I ended up going well, the other thing my dad told me is you need to get a scholarship because we cannot afford to send you to pay for the tuition, and so I was able to get a scholarship to go to the University of Southern California. And I ended up getting a 4-year degree, a Bachelor of Science in engineering. And then I was fortunate enough to work for a company called Hughes Aircraft. And at that time, they were offering a 2-year master's fellowship, where if you work for them, at least for the first 2 years, you just work 20 hours at work, and then the other 20 hours you could go to school. And so I did that, all right. But anyway, so I was able to get a master's degree in computer science, and then I ended up working for Hughes for another 32 years, and I was able to retire from them because Howard Hughes, when he started Hughes Aircraft back in the 1930s, he at that time, when you get into your 50s, you just felt you're worthless, all right? And so he had this retirement program where you could retire in the 50s with full benefits, all right? And so I took advantage of that. So I've been retired for probably over 20 years. But that's mainly due to the sacrifices that my parents and grandparents made to make a life easier for us, all right?
And you did some work after you retired too?
Yeah. When I retired, my wife was still working, all right? And she's about 6 years younger than me. So she had another 6 years to go before she could retire. Now she also worked at Hughes. So when she retired, she got a full pension and everything too. But during that 6 years, what am I going to do, right? I got all this free time. I can't really travel because my wife's working, right? So then I got really involved in real estate investing, and started buying a bunch of real estate rental houses and everything else, all right? And so that's been quite profitable, and so that gives me a lot more freedom.
Now, I understand you've done a considerable amount of research about your family. You even hired a genealogist in Japan. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah. Initially, I became involved in that just to learn a little bit about my own genealogy. Because I found out from my dad, his parents were actually distant cousins, all right? So, that's interesting. Maybe I do a genealogy and see how they're linked up, all right? And sure enough, yeah, they're distant cousins. And then I decided to find out whether you could trace back my lineage to maybe an emperor or something. And so I hired a genealogist, and he was able to link me up with the 56th emperor of Japan, Seiwa, who was died in like 1880 AD. All right. But once you link up with the emperor, then you're related to the first emperor, all right, who ruled in like 1660 BC, all right. And so, it's always interesting when you deal with genealogy to learn about your heritage, and also to learn about how the struggles, of your past ancestors allowed you to survive. And in fact, when you think about it, all of us, I think, if you dig far enough back, you were probably related to someone that was important. Because way back when, unless you were someone important, you did not get any food, all right? You would end up starving, all right? Unless you had a relative that was, actually was related to someone important that could give them some food, all right? So all of us, I think, are, if you dig far enough back, you're probably related to someone that's important, all right? Because that's why you're here. Your distant relatives were able to get you enough food so that you're here, all right?
Ray, you've had a long and interesting life. If you could give one piece of advice to others, what would that be?
Yeah. I tried, at least with my kids, I made sure that they saw me treating other people in a dignified manner, all right? And hopefully, because they see that from me, they would treat other people in a dignified manner.
So Ray, thank you. Thank you for sharing your story. And that is the end of the interview.